Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Peary and his dash for the pole. It says, when Commander Robert E. Peary, USN, returns from the Arctic regions, he will not bring the North Pole with him, as a young lady who was visiting his ship said she hoped he would. He will leave it where he finds it, if he finds it at all. There is no doubt that it is there, where it has been for endless centuries, a much coveted spot, but probably an uncomfortable place. The most interesting features of Arctic exploration have been the explorers themselves, and while to us it is a region of mysterious danger and hardship, to the Newfoundland seal fishermen and sailors, and to the Eskimos, it is a very natural and even agreeable order of things. Exploration is a temperamental gift that the born explorer never loses. Stanley was happiest when he was in the jungles of South Africa. Peary will never feel that he has reached his destination till he gets to the North Pole. To us ordinary beings who keep as close to known civilization as we can, there is something heroic and self-sacrificing in these men. It is not a heroism of their own consciousness, for a man like Peary does not know what self-consciousness is. He lives, wherever he may be, in that as yet unknown Arctic Atlantis, an isolated island continent with a fauna and flora of its own, with one day and one night in the year, lying there throughout the blinding days and opaque nights of countless geologic ages, as completely isolated from the world as if it were Mars. These are his own words, a description of what he expects to find at the North Pole, for he adds, there is no portion of the Earth's surface where it is more distinctly impossible to prophesy or forecast what is beyond the horizon of actual vision than in the Arctic regions. Perhaps no human being is without a definite dream place of some kind, not so distant as the North Pole, but quite as unattainable, unless like Peary it is a scientific mirage that lures him into action and achievement. I say mirage because both Nansen and Abruzzi, who have reached the foremost point to the pole of any expedition, declare that it is almost impossible to reach it because of the inability to ram through the huge polar packs of ice. The president of the Royal Geographical Society in London claimed that after Nansen's voyage, there was no longer any geographical object in going to the North Pole, except for the sake of deep-sea soundings, for he concluded that it was only a point in the polar ocean, the economy of which had been made known by Nansen. It was his opinion that the great explorer had finally removed the veil which concealed the secret of the Arctic regions. I found that Peary was as positive as the president of the Royal Geographical Society, but in an opposite direction, and he had the advantage of having sensed the climax of his ambition at closer range. The man who has been near enough to get a sniff of polar seas has accumulated more direct and intimate data of the possibilities in store for him than the man who stays at home and reads the charts that are sent to him. More reasons for believing the task possible and for conceiving the character of his discovery than he can remember to tell in his report. The Roosevelt, like Peary himself, was not much for style. She was a long, broad-backed, free-masted craft, with an enterprising, formidable nose, cabin space in her main center deck, and a roomy upper deck. Her funnel was past astern, and she was almost as low in the water as an ordinary tug. There was an impression among those who were allowed on board that every hard-working, sweltering sailor they saw on the decks was going to that mystic place, the North Pole. And the said deckhands, from the alert captain to the old salt, who received the young schoolmarms who swarmed aboard, posed for the notion with considerable satisfaction. They did not deny that they were going to the North Pole, and they did not affirm it. They looked wise and far away when some pretty compliment was hurled at them for their bravery. As a matter of fact, none of them were going further than Cape Breton, where Captain Samuel M. Bartlett and his sturdy crew of Newfoundland seal fishermen and Arctic sailors would begin the real chapter of interest in the story of the Roosevelt. Captain Bartlett's father had been with Peary on 2 expeditions, and when he died, his son took up the work. Arctic life is not so terrible or mysterious in its details to these men as it seems to us. And although they had the same interest in a possible success in the purposes of the expedition, they ship as other sailors do for a livelihood, without any of the intrinsic explorer's temperament in them. It was amusing to note the attitude of the scratch crew, which the newspapers and the entire river population had declared were Peary's men, bound to him by ties of heroism and bravery. The captain, for instance, a man of loud voice and determined physique, was asked what he thought of a certain steel boat that had been made in Cleveland for the expedition. "There she is over there," he said, with biting scorn in his tone and gesture, "and I wish you'd throw it overboard," as the boat was for use in polar seas that he knew very well he never expected to visit. The comment was amusing. The mate stood on the upper deck, his arms folded, the peak of his cap pulled in lowering wisdom over his eyes, and the young women clustered about him as if he were a polar bear. Peary himself was so busy raising the additional funds necessary that he kept away from the boat as much as possible. In New York, you have only to label a thing curious, and everyone believes it. No one dares to tear the label off. So one stepped aboard the Roosevelt into an elusive atmosphere, heavy with hero worship. Nobody paid the slightest attention to Matt Henson, the intelligent, courageous young man who has shared with Peary all the hardships and some executive responsibilities of each of his expeditions. He stood, leaning against the bulwarks, smoking a cigar, pleasantly, shrewdly observant of the amusing incidents on board. "I am living ashore till the very last minute," he said. "We'll get enough of the Roosevelt before we get back." The cabins were in a state of disorder. Peary's own room, large, square, comfortable in every way, was in confusion. An upright piano was conspicuous. The rest were unwrapped bundles and polished instrument cases. Coal was being put aboard from a lighter, enough to get to Cape Breton with, and the forward deck was covered with boxes of astral oil, for in the polar regions is 6 months of darkness, except for the North Star and its luminary neighbors. The ship's light is oiled during all this time, making what the Eskimos call the little sun. Among the visitors on board were skeptics. No endeavor would be interesting without a balance of opinion. So what the skeptics said I noted, and herewith publish it without endorsement. The skeptic was a man who had been out in the Arctic regions when no less a man than Nansen, and he stood leaning against the main mast on the upper deck with a sinister calm that tempted me toward him. He was a high-caste German, a student evidently of the North Pole mystery. Not knowing him, I asked if he were going with Peary. "No, I'm not, but I was just wondering whether this boat we are now on will ever do what Peary expects her to do." "She's the best ever built for the work, isn't she?" I asked. "No doubt about that, but can anyone reach the pole that way?" "Which way?" I asked, knowing no single successful way discovered so far. "Well, for instance, the way Nansen went was perfectly logical if the crew could endure the length of time necessary. He took the drifting route, which is the surest, because, you see, the currents which keep drifting the ice north carry it from the Alaskan region through Bering Straits and pass directly over the North Pole to Greenland. It was in this way Nansen came within 200 miles of the pole. Now Peary, I understand, intends to reverse this route and literally steam against the currents and against the drifts, ramming the huge polar ice walls." And the skeptic adjusted his glasses by way of habitual conclusion and smiled very slightly. Later I brought this matter up with Peary, and he answered it, but the skeptic's observation was not disputed, merely laid on the table. After a pause, the skeptic continued. "There is no doubt," he said, "that Peary has spent more money than any other North Pole explorer and produced less." "Then you are doubtful of his ability to reach the pole?" "It is a life of tremendous endurances. It requires great vitality. Youth is the price to purchase such an achievement successfully. Peary was born in 1856. That makes him 49 years old. And while he has energy, the vital spark is not so elastic as it might be. You know, he has lost 7 toes on his 2 feet in the north. And well, those sledge dashes are a terrific strain on the life fluid of a man. What is the direct danger? I asked. The first is the chance that the boat gets caught in such a jam of ice that it lifts and crushes her like an eggshell. Then, with the boat destroyed, the base of operations gone, the party must take to the sleds and exposure and possibly become lost. Then there is the terrible silence and loneliness in that midnight waste of ice and snow, I suggested. Oh, it is not so lonely. Of course, after the ship gets into winter quarters and the boilers are blown out, the forward part of the deck is usually banked with snow. They put up an awning and bank the snow high on each side as a shelter from the winds, always keeping a clear gangway. The ship is always well lighted with oil lamps. The Eskimos, always cheerful and merry, play games on the ice. There is music, singing, reading, hunting, and sleep. No, the Arctic life is not unendurable, not monotonous. The compass is always reliable? Not always, but the North Star never fails. And then there is the dipper needle. The skeptic had done something for me. He had made the North Pole a definite thing, placed it in the mind's eye, drawn a silhouette of Arctic life that was normal and endurable. Nansen had convinced the Royal Geographical Society of London that the North Pole was a place for soundings. Peary had convinced the National Geographical Society of Washington that there may be a vast unknown area of land, as completely isolated from the world as if it were on Mars. It was because of this that the little steamer attracted the attention of New York, that she became a thing of magic interest to the traffic on the North River. In plain white letters across her stern, one reads Roosevelt, New York. And if Peary succeeds, and if there be unknown inhabitants on the unknown land he speaks of, they will be inclined to believe that the center of the universe is grounded around these 2 names, the man and his birthplace. Check back soon for part 2 of this incredible story. This story came from the great state of Nebraska, being reported in the Lincoln Daily Star of August 6, 1905. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.